The morning my husband told me our marriage was over, I was standing in our kitchen at 6 a.m. making his coffee exactly the way he liked it. 2 sugars, oat milk, heated to 65 degrees because anything hotter and he'd send it back. 10 years of marriage and I still timed it with a thermometer. He walked in, set his phone face down on the counter and said, "I need you to move out by the end of the month," just like that, the way you'd cancel a dentist appointment. My name is Simone. I'm 38 years old and I was a licensed occupational therapist working with pediatric patients at a rehab center in Burlington, Ontario. I had a good salary, a nice car, a house I helped pay for every single month, and a husband named, I'll just call him my husband because honestly that title is the only thing left of him worth remembering. We met when I was 27. He was charming in that particular way that reads as confidence when you're young and reads as arrogance when you're older and wiser. He had a way of making you feel chosen, special, like you were the only person in the room worth looking at. I fell hard and fast and I never quite caught my footing after that. For the first 4 years we were happy, or I thought we were. Then I was diagnosed with endometriosis and everything shifted. The fertility treatment started when I was 32, 2 rounds of IUI, then IVF, then another round. My body became a schedule. A series of injections and blood draws and ultrasounds and waiting rooms where everyone was trying not to make eye contact. My husband came to the first 2 appointments and then started having conflicts, work dinners, a conference in Calgary, a golf weekend with clients. I stopped asking him to come. I told myself he was supporting us financially while I focused on this. I made excuses for him with the same energy I should have been using to see clearly. After the 3rd failed cycle, our fertility specialist gently suggested we consider other options. I cried in the car for 40 minutes before driving home. My husband was on the phone when I walked in. He held up one finger, 1 minute, and kept talking. I made dinner. We ate in near silence. He said, "Maybe it's just not meant to happen for us," and went upstairs to watch television. That was 8 months before he told me to move out. What I didn't know then, what I was the last to find out, which is always how it goes, was that he had been seeing someone from his office for almost a year, a junior account manager, 26 years old, whom I had met at his company's Christmas party in December. She'd shaken my hand and said she'd heard so much about me. I'd smiled and said it was lovely to meet her. The morning he told me to move out, I didn't cry. I think I was too stunned to cry. I stood there holding his coffee, and I said, "What?" He pulled a manila envelope from his laptop bag and set it on the counter. I had papers drawn up. It's straightforward. We split the joint accounts. You keep your RRSP, I keep mine. The house goes on the market. You had papers drawn up, I repeated. I've been talking to a lawyer for a few months. It's just cleaner this way. A few months, while I was at appointments alone. While I was timing his coffee to 65 degrees, I set the mug down very carefully so I wouldn't throw it at him. Then I picked up the envelope, walked upstairs, and sat on the edge of our bed for a long time. The papers were thorough. He'd been planning this for a while. The joint account had already been moved into his sole name. I didn't know you could do that, but apparently you can if one party initiates it before the other notices. I had $12,000 in my personal checking account and my own RRSP. The car was leased in both our names. The house had equity, but nothing would be accessible until it sold. I called my sister that afternoon. She drove from Hamilton in under an hour and sat with me on the kitchen floor. I don't know how we ended up on the floor, but that's where we were. And she said, "You're not staying in this house one more night if he's still here." She was right. I wasn't. I ended up in a furnished bachelor unit in a building off Appleby Line. Month-to-month lease, 650 square feet, a window that faced a parking garage. It was clean, it was perfectly functional. It was the loneliest place I had ever lived in my life. I want to be clear about something, because I think this is the part people gloss over in stories like this. The months after a divorce don't always feel like the beginning of something better. Sometimes they just feel like loss. Raw, unglamorous, quiet loss. I'd come home from work, eat something I didn't taste, and lie on the pull-out sofa I'd bought secondhand from Marketplace. Because I hadn't gotten around to buying a real bed yet, I'd listen to the traffic outside the parking garage window and think about nothing and everything at the same time. I wasn't devastated about my husband, exactly. I think I'd already been grieving the marriage for years without admitting it. What I was devastated about was the decade, the fertility treatments I'd gone through largely alone, the version of my future, children, a family, a home that felt permanent, that had quietly been cancelled without my knowledge. My mother called every second day. She didn't say much. She'd ask if I'd eaten, if I was sleeping, whether I'd called my union rep about the extended benefits, practical questions. I loved her for that. She knew I didn't want to talk about feelings. I wanted someone to sit with me in the practicality of survival. The lease on my car was due for renewal in April. My husband's lawyer sent a letter suggesting I should simply return the vehicle since he'd been making the payments. His lawyer was wrong about that. I'd contributed to those payments for 3 years out of our joint account, and I had the bank records. My own lawyer, a small, fierce woman named, well, I just called her my lawyer, sent a response that apparently made his lawyer rethink the whole approach rather quickly. I kept the car. Small victories, you collect them. It was around that time that I first properly noticed my neighbor. His unit was across the hall. He'd moved in sometime in November, around the same time I did, and for the first several weeks we'd only exchanged that particular Canadian hallway nod. The one that says I see you, I acknowledge you, I will not bother you. He was probably 45, maybe a bit older, with the kind of quiet stillness about him that you either find unnerving or calming. I found it calming, which surprised me. One evening in January, I was wrestling with a bag of groceries and my keys and dropped everything on the hallway floor. He came out of his unit immediately and helped me pick things up without making a production of it. We introduced ourselves. He told me his name was, I'll call him my neighbor and you'll understand why later. He said he'd just taken early retirement after a long career in federal law enforcement and was figuring out what the next chapter looked like. I said I was figuring out the same thing, more or less. We started having coffee occasionally. In the tiny common area off the building's lobby, where there was a table and 2 chairs that no one else ever used. He was an easy person to talk to, not intrusive, not performatively empathetic. He listened in a way that made you feel heard without feeling exposed. I told him about the divorce, about the fertility treatments. He didn't offer opinions about my husband or tell me things happened for a reason. He just said, that's a lot to carry around for a long time. It was. It really was. He had his own losses. He didn't share them all at once, and I didn't push. There had been a marriage early in his career. No children, years of work that kept him away more than it kept him home, until one day he came home and she was gone. He said it without self-pity, the way people talk about things they've had a long time to make peace with. By February we were having dinner sometimes. Nothing romantic, or at least I told myself that, which probably means it was already becoming something. He cooked. He was startlingly good at it, the kind of cooking that doesn't require a recipe because the knowledge has just become part of how you move around a kitchen. I'd bring wine or dessert and we'd sit at his small table and talk until it was somehow 11 o'clock. I was careful with myself. I'd learned enough by then to not mistake comfort for love or loneliness for connection. I paid attention to how I felt in the aftermath of those evenings, not giddy and anxious the way my husband had made me feel in the early years, not performing anything, just quiet and settled. That was new. In March, I got a call from my doctor's office. A routine follow-up from the fertility clinic, updating my file now that I was no longer in treatment. They asked if I was still interested in a referral for counseling. I said I'd think about it. Then I asked, on a strange instinct I couldn't quite explain, whether there was any medical reason I couldn't conceive naturally given my diagnosis. The nurse practitioner was thoughtful. She said endometriosis complicated things, but it didn't make conception impossible. The IVF had failed, but IVF failure didn't tell the whole story. Some of their patients with my profile had conceived without intervention. She said the stress load of the treatment cycles themselves could sometimes be a factor, and that she'd seen cases where removing that stress, the procedures, the scheduling, the pressure, had changed outcomes. I hung up and sat with that for a long time. By April, my neighbor and I had stopped pretending the dinners were just neighborly. I want to say it happened slowly and then all at once, which is the only accurate way I know to describe it. One evening he said something that made me laugh, really laugh, the kind that catches you off guard, and I thought, oh, there you are, the version of me that still knows how to do this. He was patient in a way I hadn't encountered before. He didn't move fast. He didn't make me feel like I needed to perform recovery or gratitude or optimism. He just showed up consistently in the small ordinary ways that actually matter. In May, I found out I was pregnant. I sat on the bathroom floor of my 650-square-foot apartment for about 20 minutes before I could stand up. I'd taken the test mostly out of habit. I'd been testing reflexively for years, a leftover from the treatment cycles, and I'd learned to expect nothing. The 2 lines appeared so quickly that I thought the test was defective. I took 3 more. When I told my neighbor, he went very still for a moment. Then he sat down beside me on the couch and took my hand and said, "How are you feeling about this? Not what do you want to do? Not is it mine, because of course it was. There was no question about that. Just, how are you feeling?" I said I didn't know yet. That was true. I was terrified and overwhelmed, and somewhere underneath all of that was something that felt dangerously close to joy, and I didn't trust it yet. He said, "Whatever you decide, I'm not going anywhere." My first ultrasound was 6 weeks later. I went alone because I wanted to be alone for it. I needed to be the first person to know whatever there was to know, without having to manage anyone else's reaction in real time. The technician was quiet for a moment after starting the scan, and I braced for something bad the way you do when you've been through enough medical appointments to know that silence can mean anything. Then she turned the screen toward me. There were 2 twins. I called my neighbor from the parking lot. I couldn't speak for about 30 seconds. He waited. When I finally got the words out, there was a long pause on his end too, and then he said, "I'm coming to get you. Stay where you are." He drove to the clinic in Oakville and found me sitting on a bench outside the entrance, still holding the ultrasound photos. He sat down next to me without saying anything, and I leaned into him, and we stayed like that for a while, watching cars pull in and out of the parking lot, and it was one of the strangest and most right moments of my life. There is something I need to tell you about my neighbor. Something I didn't know for quite a long time, because he wasn't the kind of person who led with it. What I knew was that he was retired from federal law enforcement. What I didn't know, what came out gradually in pieces over several months, was the specifics of what that meant. He hadn't been a regular officer. He'd spent the better part of 2 decades in a senior investigative role with a major crimes unit. The kind of work that doesn't have a job title you can easily explain at dinner parties. He'd been involved in cases that I'd actually read about in the news without ever connecting them to a person I knew. His name had been in the Globe and Mail twice, not for anything shameful, for commendations, for work that was genuinely significant. He'd taken early retirement because of a health scare 2 years prior. He was fine now, fully recovered, but it had recalibrated something for him. He said he'd spent 30 years being useful to institutions, and he wanted to spend whatever time was left being useful to people. Real people, in front of him. That was why he was in a furnished apartment in Burlington figuring out the next chapter. I found all of this out in increments, and each time I did, I had to quietly revise my understanding of who he was. Not because it changed my feelings, it didn't, but because there was something humbling about realizing you'd been sitting across from a person for months, sharing meals and talking about ordinary things, and only gradually learning the dimensions of them. He told my mother. He asked if he could call her, and I said yes. I don't know exactly what he said to her because I gave them privacy, but she called me afterward and just said, "I like him very much, Simone," which from my mother is practically a declaration of devotion. The divorce was finalized in August. My lawyer had been thorough, and my husband's initial asset proposal had been revised substantially in my favor. The equity from the house sale, my RRSP, and a settlement for the joint account that had been emptied. I came out with enough to properly start over. I bought furniture. Real furniture, not marketplace furniture. I bought a bed. My neighbor and I started looking at houses in September. Not urgently, the twins weren't due until January, but practically because a 650 square foot apartment was not going to accommodate 2 infants and the amount of equipment they apparently required. We found a place in Grimsby near the escarpment with a backyard and enough bedrooms and a kitchen large enough for someone who actually used kitchens. We made an offer, they accepted. We moved in November. My husband found out about the pregnancy through mutual friends. We had fewer than I'd realized, which turns out to be clarifying. Sometime in September, he didn't reach out to me directly. I heard through my sister that he'd seemed unsettled by the news. She told me this with barely concealed satisfaction, which I appreciated. What I heard later, and this came to me secondhand, through a former colleague of his who still occasionally kept in touch with me, was that the woman from his office had announced she was pregnant, and that subsequent events had made clear the timing didn't quite align with their relationship. My former colleague told me this delicately, with significant use of euphemism, but the implication was plain enough. My husband had left a marriage in part because I couldn't give him children, had taken up with someone younger, and had now found himself in a situation considerably more complicated than he'd planned for. I'm not proud to say I felt a cold, clear satisfaction when I heard that. I'd have preferred to feel nothing. But I'm also not going to pretend I didn't feel it. The twins were born in January, 3 weeks early, in a hospital in Hamilton. A boy and a girl, both healthy, both small in the way that early babies are small. Fierce little creatures in incubators for the first week, breathing through tiny perfect noses, wrapped in hospital blankets that seemed absurdly large for them. My neighbor, my partner by then, though we hadn't put a particular label on it, stayed with me through all of it. He was extraordinarily calm in the way that people with crisis experience can be calm, which was exactly what I needed, because I was not calm at all. My mother arrived the same day they were born and didn't leave for 3 weeks. My sister came the day after with enough groceries to feed a small organization. My mother-in-law, my ex-husband's mother whom I had called family for a decade, sent a card. Just a card. I suppose that was something. What nobody tells you about having twins, especially when you've spent years being told it was unlikely you'd have any children at all, is that the joy is physically exhausting. Not just the logistics of it, though those are genuinely relentless, but the joy itself. The weight of getting exactly what you'd given up on. I'd find myself standing over their crib at 2 a.m, not because they needed me but because I couldn't stop looking at them, and I'd feel something so large I didn't have a word for it. My neighbor, my partner, I'll just say my partner now, was extraordinary with them. I'd expected him to be capable. I hadn't expected him to be natural. He'd never been a parent and yet he moved around the babies with an ease that took my breath away. He could settle our son when no one else could. Our daughter had his eyes. Spring came and that house felt like it had always been ours. I went back to work part-time in the fall, and my partner took on more of the primary caregiving, which worked for us both in ways that would have been impossible to plan in advance but felt obvious in retrospect. He had the time and the temperament and the patience. I had the income and, honestly, the need for a few hours each day that were mine and that involved something other than feeding schedules. We had dinner one evening in October, just the two of us, the babies asleep, and the house quiet in that particular way it gets in autumn when the windows are closed against the cold. He'd made roast chicken. There was a bottle of Ontario Pinot Noir open on the table. He'd lit candles, which he didn't usually do. He said, "I have something to tell you." I set down my glass. I've been in enough situations where someone sets a particular tone before speaking that I know how to brace. He said that an inquiry had contacted him in the spring, shortly before the twins were born, asking him to consider a senior advisory role with a national oversight body. Not field work, not investigation, policy and review, informing how major crimes units across the country were structured and supervised. Significant work. The kind of work he'd said he was done with. He said he'd declined at the time without telling me because he hadn't wanted to add anything to what we were already navigating. He said they had come back in August, and he had spent 2 months thinking about whether he wanted to tell me at all, or whether simply declining again was easier. I asked why he was telling me now. He said because he'd decided to accept, and he wanted me to know before he gave them his answer. He said it would mean some travel, not the constant absence of his earlier career, but regular trips to Ottawa, occasionally international. And he'd wanted to know if I could live with that, if it changed anything for me, if there were conditions I needed in place before he answered. I looked at him across the table, in our house, with our children sleeping down the hall, and I thought about all the things I'd spent a decade trying to hold together with someone who had never once asked me what I needed before making a decision. I told him to accept. He called them the next morning. He told me after, and there was a particular look on his face, relief and purpose mixed together, that I had never seen on a person before but immediately recognized as what it looks like when someone is doing exactly the right thing. I want to tell you one more thing, because it's the thing I didn't expect and it's the thing I think about most now. About a year after the twins were born, I ran into my ex-husband. Not planned. I was at a farmer's market in Burlington with both babies strapped into a double stroller, my hair in a ponytail, wearing a jacket with what was probably sweet potato on the left shoulder, because that was life then. He was across the row of vegetable stalls before I saw him. He looked the same. Maybe a little tired around the eyes. He saw me at almost the same moment. He saw the stroller. He looked at the twins, probably a year old now, sitting up and regarding the world with the absolute authority of very small people who have no doubt about their importance, and then he looked at me. I don't know what I expected to feel. Maybe anger, maybe the vindication I'd been quietly carrying for 2 years. maybe nothing. What I felt was something much simpler. I felt free. He said my name. I nodded. He said they were beautiful, meaning the twins. I said thank you. He said something vague about hoping I was well. I said I was, which was true in a way that would have taken too long to explain and wasn't his to know anymore. Then I turned the stroller and walked the other direction, toward the bread stall where I'd been headed, and I didn't look back. My partner was waiting at the car. He'd gone ahead with the market bags while I'd lingered at the flower stall. When I got there, I was quiet for a minute, loading the stroller into the trunk, and he waited, because that's what he does, and then I said, I just ran into my ex-husband. He looked at me carefully. You okay? I buckled our daughter into her car seat and looked at her small, serious face and thought about 10 years of fertility treatments and 65-degree coffee and a manila envelope on a counter and a parking lot in Oakville and 2 lines on a test and a man who drove 40 minutes to sit beside me on a bench without saying anything. Yeah, I said, I really am. Our daughter grabbed my finger and held on, the way babies do when they've decided you're not going anywhere. She wasn't wrong.